Never.
This is the One Accord Podcast, and on today's episode of the Biblical Theology Project, we are picking it back up in the book of Leviticus, and our plan is to cover chapters 5 through 9. And as always, we've got Greg, and we've got Eric, and we've got Micah again. And Micah, it's good to see you again so soon. Typically, we don't see you so regularly, and we've never had you on the Biblical Theology Project. We've had you when we talked about the systematic stuff. But Micah, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you guys?
I'm doing good. Eric, what about you? Anything new or exciting in your world?
A lot, too much to talk about today. But I'm glad that Micah's on the show, and looking forward to dialoguing with him and having having four wheels on the car rather than three.
That's right. We've upgraded. We're no longer a tricycle, so that's good. Greg, how are you today?
Doing great. I kind of resent the whole tricycle thing, but
have you felt like the third wheel all along?
I felt like the third wheel.
I did not mean that.
I'm the square wheel that's just thumping along in the back. So
yeah. Well, it is good to see you all, and Mike, I'm especially excited to have you on here. You know, many people might not know this, but the original version of the show, we did intend to have you on more regularly, and things didn't work out in the past. So we've always been thankful when you have been on, but it is great to have you here, and we're looking forward. I know you have a valuable perspective to add to the conversation. So with all that said, why don't we just go ahead and dive right in? Again, we're covering 5 chapters today, Leviticus chapter 5 through 9, so we're not going to take the time to read it on camera. If you're not familiar with those chapters and you're watching this, we would encourage you to make sure that you're familiar with that. So why don't you go ahead and pause the video and read it. But we're going to dive right in. The first 4 verses of chapter 5 of Leviticus really outline a number of ways in which an Israelite could become guilty. What are your thoughts on just kind of the things being discussed in Leviticus 5, 1 through 4?
Well, there's a lot to say because there's a lot of different kinds of things here, a lot of different kinds of laws. The law in verse 1 really stood out to me, and it says, "Now if a person sins after he hears a public adjuration to testify when he is a witness, whether he has seen or otherwise known, if he does not tell it, then he will bear his guilt." And I thought that was really interesting. It's a lot of these laws are, of course, they all reflect the character of God, but also they anticipate the fallenness of man. And if you read, like, it's almost like God saying, "I know what you're probably going to do. At least in some cases, I know what you're going to be tempted to do, but I'm warning you ahead of time. Don't do it." And this is, I think, it sounds like this is a sin of omission because it's describing a person who witnesses a crime or something, but refuses to testify in court, and by withholding evidence, the person actually becomes, in a way, an accomplice in the crime. And so God takes his laws very seriously. God takes justice very, very seriously. Actually, the Bible says God hates injustice. He hates a false witness or someone who refuses to, testify when they have information that needs to be brought forth. So God takes his law very seriously. We saw earlier in the book, earlier in I should say in Exodus, where God, he punishes his people, and in our culture, these things look pretty severe. Like, wow, God had all these people killed. Well, he told them in advance, don't do it. Don't do these evil things. And so we see that God wants justice to be upheld, but he also knows man's heart. He knows man's inclinations. He knows what man is tempted to do in these different situations. And so he's warning them in advance, knowing their hearts, don't do this, or there's going to be consequences.
Do you think that in our modern day, I've witnessed car accidents and stuff where people just drive away. Like, you think this is that kind of thing where if you saw something, that's what's being described, because the language is a little bit strange and it probably could be misunderstood. So the way you're describing this is if somebody sees something and then doesn't say anything, that is by omitting the truth, they are now an accomplice. You said that. I think that is interesting. Any you guys read it differently than that, or any of you, are you guys basically understand verse 1 the same way?
I understand verse 1 in basically the same way. I also think this set of verses is really interesting because, and Eric got to this a little bit with sins of omission. We think of sins of commission and sins of omission. Sins of omission are far more likely to go unnoticed by us, and that's specifically true as you come to verses, I think verse 4 especially, in this passage where it talks about if anyone utters with his lips a rash oath to do evil or to do good, the sort of rash oath that people swear and it's hidden from him, when he comes to know it and realizes his guilt in any of these, and then he confesses his sin that he's committed and he brings to the Lord his compensation. I think sins of omission are far more likely to go unnoticed by us. Obviously, this rash oath is a sin of commission, but I was struck by, I think these verses point to the pervasiveness of our sin and our sinful nature. These remnants of the flesh that still dwell in us. Like Eric was saying, God anticipates that these are going to be the things that you are tempted to do, and He anticipates that you might not even know it in the moment when you do these things, but it's still sin. It still needs compensated. It still needs sacrifice. It should give us a glimpse of just how corrupt we actually are, I think.
Yeah, I think that's well said. In our last episode, we talked a bit about that, just how difficult it is to maintain this presence of a holy God amongst these people. And again, in these initial verses of this chapter, I'm struck with how impossible it would be to live without guilt for any long period of time. There's always something, and even just the anticipation of, well, stuff that I'm not even aware of is causing me to be defiled. Things that I might have touched in some of these other verses, things that I saw and I just didn't do enough about, or I spoke something rashly and I wasn't even aware really of these consequences. And so in the modern day, especially, I think probably for this group as they're receiving this law, to just realize, okay, this is a lot. And of course, in our last episode, we talked about how that should cause us to have this appreciation for really, truly what Christ has done from us. And I had taken away the threat of demerits back then. And so I guess I'll take the demerit this time for bringing us back to that conversation. But for this group and this community to understand that what holiness really is, it is so much beyond what the natural mind would think. And I think that as we look at this, even as modern readers, many people just go, this is almost oppressive, or it's too difficult. Who could abide by this? Which I think is exactly the point. And so God is being incredibly gracious to them in allowing, okay, there's things that you're going to do. You're going to be guilty. You won't even know it. I know you're guilty, says God, but you won't even know it. And when you become aware of it, then this is the sacrifice that you're supposed to offer. So we see God, even his restraining hand, he's not bringing judgment or wrath upon people, but it also doesn't absolve their guilt. So ignorance is no excuse, which we discussed last time. But Greg, you got any thoughts on this as well?
Well, to your point, you say that, this sounds oppressive and it sounds hard, but it sounds great. Like if everybody else lived like this around me, sounds like paradise to me.
For the record, I don't think it sounds.
No.
I
know you don't.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely, but imagine living in a society where if a wrong was committed and somebody came forward and said, "Hey, come and testify and give us honest testimony," and there'd be a punishment for dishonest testimony, and all the honest witnesses came forth, and all the people who didn't want to venture into dishonest testimony didn't. Think how much better our legal system would be. And this goes on and on. Yes, this is hard. Yes, there are many things here that I go, man, I don't want to be ignorantly sinning against God and be guilty for that. But if our society could live by these things, what a great place to live.
Well, I agree with that. I don't know if you guys have ever had to give testimony in court or something. I witnessed a pretty bad accident, and it wasn't good. It was really bad, and there were many, many witnesses. And as far as I know, I'm one of the only who actually stuck around and gave a report to the police officers. And then I actually had to get called in, and I can't remember what they call that when have a deposition, and I had both sides of the attorneys are asking me questions, and one guy's really trying to be aggressive with me, and the other guy, because they didn't like what I had to say, and they're trying to, discredit all my testimony. And if everybody was there and would have given testimony, it just would have been an open and shut thing. But instead, they're, now all of a sudden I'm on trial, and like, what are you doing? Why are you saying that? Like, I'm doing it because I don't know. I saw it and it was awful, and I stuck around, And they said, "Do you know the other people?" Because I talked about other people that even got out of their cars and tried to help. And there was a nurse who ran and tried to give immediate aid, and then even she left. And they were like, "Do you know her name?" Yeah, I have no idea who she was. We were a bunch of people at an intersection that this happened, and then most people just scattered like ants and got out of there as fast as they could. And I understand why people wouldn't want to do that, because it was a lot. I had to take a bunch of time out of my schedule, and I had to go and get, browbeaten by this opposing attorney who's calling me a liar, and he has these expert witnesses taking pictures of stuff saying, "Do you want to rethink your testimony?" All this. It's like, am I in a movie or a television show? What's going on? But I felt at that time that was the right thing to do, because I saw something that happened, and it was unfortunate. But I bet you that almost everybody else that was there that left didn't feel like they did anything wrong. And so if it wasn't for the law saying that this actually does incur guilt, because they didn't do the thing, the omission stuff is pretty big. What do you think about the even just contact with there's some other things in here in these verses as well. Contact with unclean things can also, touching human uncleanness, these types of things. You have any thoughts about that aspect of these first couple of verses?
Nothing that jumps off the page at me, but again, if this is about being clean with God, if this is about standing right before Him and being acceptable to Him, how can I ignore the unintentional? Right, like if I go and if touching a dead carcass makes me unclean, and therefore I don't have the right to enter into His presence, I need to be aware of the fact that unintentionally doing that makes me just as unclean as doing it intentionally. So it's, we often want to say, "Oh, it's just the disposition of your heart." Well, it's just the disposition of your heart and the things you do. You are a holistic person, and so it's all fair play. How sad if God hadn't told them that's the case.
Yeah, those are good points. As I was thinking about these things, we talked earlier about maybe I don't think it's bad, or our culture doesn't think it's bad, but really it's what God thinks. His opinion is really what matters. And it's amazing to me how much I've had to change my mind about how I think about sin over the years. I think Micah was getting at this earlier. There are things like I feel in my heart that certain things shouldn't be wrong, or that God shouldn't take certain things seriously. And I think that because I don't take those things very seriously. So two things have to happen. Either God has to change or I have to change. And so
which one's more likely?
I'm going to do the wise thing, and I'm going to be the one that changes, because God is not going to change. So as I look at these things, I think, man, how much more do I need to change? And I need to humble myself and recognize that if God says this is wrong, then I just have to say, okay, you're right, I'm wrong. You're good, I'm bad. And that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
it seems like there's a relationship here between the more ceremonial aspects, like touching a carcass. That's obviously, that's something that's ceremonial. Like, we wouldn't say that touching a dead carcass today makes us unfit to come into God's presence. So there are ceremonial aspects of this. There are civil aspects of it, and there are definite moral aspects of it too, all sort of tied up in these first four verses. I mean, a neglect to testify when you've witnessed something is a failure to do what's right and to speak the truth. That's a violation of God's moral law. When it comes to the carcasses, and the things that make you ceremonially unclean, well, now you're getting into something that isn't perhaps wrong in and of itself, but after God says it's wrong, after God says this makes you unclean and unfit to enter my presence. Well, now, yes, absolutely. But the relationship between those two things is important to, I think, put our finger on. These ceremonial laws are given to indicate just the level of separateness that is required. That's when we think of holiness, we think of separation. Just the level of separation from anything sinful or unclean or anything like that that is required to come into God's presence. So even if the ceremonial aspects of it are somewhat symbolic, they are pointing to the level of purity that is needed to enter into the presence of a holy God.
And I think it's important to take note of where it says, if a person sins, it's one thing, or if you come in contact and you become unclean, if you're guilty of becoming unclean, and I think that points to, I want to be careful how we draw distinctions, because the ceremonial law and the civil law and the moral law, they aren't given in neat, clean categories in the Bible for us. We would read through the text of Scripture and we'd have to go, oh, this one here is ceremonial, but I think we're helped by the fact that it says, oh, you become unclean. Okay, well, here's how you deal with that uncleanness. But here in verse 1, we're dealing with a sin, and that is substantially different than becoming unclean.
Well, Greg, your previous point about kind of the holistic nature of these things, I think the ceremonial and moral aspect, yes, for us as new covenant believers, we try and maybe disentwine those a little bit.
Try to sometimes.
But as we're reading here, these are very much entwined, because it is about maintaining that presence of God among them, worshiping the Lord individually, and then part of this community. And so, yes, these things do make you guilty. And the nature of that guilt there might be nuance to it, but all of these things then begin to disqualify you from drawing near to the Lord and really enjoying that unbroken fellowship. And they need to have this guilt dealt with. And so, of course, there are these various offerings. As we continue on in the chapter, we see verses 7 through 13, including different kinds of offerings that they could give. What's the reason for these different types of offerings that God is prescribing?
Well, I think that God seems to have made accommodations for those who couldn't afford to give more costly offerings. Some offerings were more costly than others. Giving an animal as opposed to giving, let's say, like a grain or something. Those are obviously two very different things. So I really love the fact that God, doesn't expect everybody to be at the same level. And not only that, but people just simply have different. What's the word I'm looking for?
Means,
yeah, different means, and like different occupations, and people, just people are different. And so God has, he's made accommodations for that, and he's not like unrealistic and tyrannical and just expects the impossible from people. He says, if you can, all you can give is some bread. Okay, well then, I'll accept that. If that's all you can give, if that's your best, then I will accept that. If you can give, if your best is an animal, okay, well then I expect that. So God is, I see that, like, throughout Scripture, despite what people may think, God is very reasonable. And here he's, in these chapters, he's defining uncleanness and sin and guilt and all this stuff. But he also says, but I've made a way for you to deal with this. You can make offerings and make up for this. So I just think this reveals the grace and kindness of God.
I think that there's also an important distinction to draw between the one true God and the sacrificial demands of pagan gods here. For instance, some of those pagan gods, you bring them offerings because of their need. You're trying to pay them off. You're trying to please them in a way that puts them in your debt because you've given them something that they desired or something like that. That is not the sacrificial system that God has instituted for his people here. This comes from God's abundance and his provision for his people that extends from the highest to the lowliest. He doesn't institute the sacrificial system out of any need in and of himself, and I think that's evidenced in the fact that he said, if all you can afford is pigeons, bring pigeons. If you can afford a goat, bring a goat. If you can afford, he's making provision for his people for their sin to be dealt with out of his abundance, out of no need in and of himself. That draws a stark distinction between the nature of the one true God and the pagan gods that surround Israel.
Yeah, that reasonable nature, and then also not despising these smaller things. It's not like he's disappointed because, of course, God doesn't need these sacrifices. This is an offer to them to demonstrate they understand that they're guilty and that they don't deserve to have the presence of God among them. And so, yes, he is very reasonable. And if you don't have enough, okay, offer. It's also curious. He doesn't let anybody off the hook. Oh, you're poor? Okay, you don't have to do anything. No, you still have to do something. But what can you do? All right, do that. And he doesn't despise those smaller things. If he receives a smaller offering from someone with less means, he receives that just as willingly as he receives a larger offering from somebody with larger means. Greg, I think I jumped on you.
You made the point that I was going to.
I wanted to get credit for that.
Yeah, you got credit.
Point.
extra points for Joe.
Yeah.
You go back and you read how worship looked like. I mean, even up to the Greeks, where the more you offered, the more pleasing you were. This isn't what this is saying. The person who had only the smallest amount of means was just as acceptable, placed in just as right of relationship with God as the person who could have afforded to do 100 bulls or whatever it happened to be. So,
yeah, you guys got anything else on this before we move into chapter 6?
Nope.
Doesn't seem like it. All right. Well, in chapter 6, the first 7 verses include laws regarding theft and restitution. And verse 2 says something that's pretty interesting. It says, sinning against one's companion is acting unfaithfully against the Lord. What do you make about this phrase here in verse 2 in particular?
Well, even though the verse is talking about sinning against one's neighbor, the law was given by God, and therefore any violation was considered unfaithfulness against God. Really, every sin is a sin against God, even if it's directed at a particular person. I guess many sins can be directed at people, but every time we sin against a person, we're sinning against God also. I mean, this is God's world. All of us are under the authority of God. All of us are, in a sense, I don't want to say this in the wrong way, but it's like, God is king over all the nations and king over all peoples. And so whenever we sin against somebody, we are, it's a sin within, God's jurisdiction, if that's the right word to use. Like, God has authority over everybody. So if you sin anywhere, anytime against any person, that is an offense to God. This is His world, we're His people, His creations. And so I think looking at it that way, and there's a verse that's come into my mind, but it's New Testament.
Do it. Come on,
I'm resisting the urge.
Do it.
But I'm gonna fight the temptation. But yeah, so I think, but see, this is so important, because if we look at every sin as unfaithfulness to God, like let's say I don't like somebody, and I do something to them that I shouldn't have done. Okay, I repay evil with evil. I might think to myself, I don't like that person. That person's kind of had that coming. They deserve that. But if I'm doing them evil, and I recognize that any evil is evil against God, well, that puts things into a very different perspective. So, these are God's law. God's the one that gave these laws. These came from Him. We're violating, His statutes whenever we sin. So that, for me, that's how I think we need to look at this, and that helps us to put things into perspective.
Yeah, and I think that this also points to just how you guys were talking earlier, but specifically even within the moral law, how intertwined it is, how interdependent each of if you wanted to talk about the 10 Commandments, how interdependent they are. Because in this particular situation, you have someone who sins and commits a breach of faith against the Lord by deceiving his neighbor in a matter of deposit, security, or through robbery. Okay, so if you've deceived your neighbor in a matter of deposit or security, you've committed some sort of financial crime against him. Well, think about the breadth of what you've done there. Well, first of all, thou shalt not steal. You've stolen. But you've also coveted. And But that's not all you've done. In stealing and in coveting, you have considered something else so much more desirable than the Lord himself that you thought it was worth breaking God's command. So you've also broken the first table of God's law too, the first commandment. You've at least within your own heart bowed your knee to an idol. You've considered something else more desirable or more satisfying than God himself, worthy of loving above what God has told you to do. So all these laws are just so interdependent. When you sin against your neighbor, you do sin against God, because all of it is rooted in idolatry.
Yeah. This definitely points to the reality that we are first and foremost walking in the sight and walking before God. Every action we take is either a godly action, a God honoring action, or it's an action that doesn't. There is no neutrality with God. You're either for God or you're against God. You're either with him or you're against him. And so everything that I do, while I might tease or poke fun at Eric or make fun of Eric, if I'm sinning against Eric, I'm sinning against a child of the King. I am in some way violating an expectation that God has for me. And so in our modern day 21st century America, we like to think of many things as neutral, many things as common or not religious. But I don't think that there's anything that we can do as created beings, individuals created in the image of God, that doesn't somehow, some way directly connect back to the Creator.
Yeah, no, that's very well said. It is interesting, and you guys have hit, I think, on all these concepts. But sometimes people think, oh, okay, well, it's sin against God. Does that mean it's not a sin against a person? No, it's both. It's both and so these verses include, all right, if I sin against you, I have to make restitution to you, but then I also have to acknowledge that just because I've done right by you now doesn't mean that it's okay. I've still sinned against God. And it's curious how many people I've met, who look at the just the awful ways that humans act amongst each other, and then use that as like evidence that God couldn't be real, or that why worship a God, to realize that what this is telling us is that when God looks at how human beings are awful to each other, this is sin against God. So we're sinning against each other and we're sinning against God. God is very displeased with the ways that we treat each other. And I think it ties back to the fact that he made us in his image. I didn't necessarily hear any of that language, but do you guys think that that's going too far?
I think I said those words exactly.
Did you? Did I
made
like zone out
in
for a
the
second?
image of God, yeah.
I guess I just zoned out for a second.
That's normal. So you sinned against me, but okay.
I did. I'm sorry. I was so focused. I was waiting for you to confess and say, Eric, I'm so sorry for all the things I've said about you, and I'll never do it again. That's what I was waiting for. I guess I zoned out when you said that. So
I refuse to believe that they aren't justified. And
I will acknowledge that, Greg, you made a great point. I do believe that is tied back to the initial creation narrative that we read in Genesis. And, so many people think that God is just this angry, I used that word oppressive before, oppressive tyrant. But God loves what he has made, and that includes people made in his image. And the laws that he gives, Greg, you said not too long ago, like, wouldn't it be great if people took responsibility and weren't awful to each other? And when people were awful to each other, like, we all as a community bore that burden together and said, yeah, this thing happened and it wasn't right. And here's the guilty party. And we just didn't let those who had, more means grind the face of the poor or whatever else. Like there would be a peace that could come, but we take it, in portions, and we think in our minds things that we've all said, like, well, I don't think that this is a big deal. Well, if God said it, it is a big deal. And then as a result of it, we're not only just sinning against each other, but we are sinning against God. And then we use that as further evidence to blaspheme his name, to go, oh, if God's so great, why is the world so terrible? Well, because we don't listen to him at all. And that's what really makes, again, the overwhelming aspect of this still for me is that God is still dwelling in their midst. As he's describing all the things that we do that displease him, It gets back to why Moses was pleading, please don't leave. He's like, if I go with you for even a second, I'll destroy you. All of that is still true. And so this is still abundantly gracious in my mind, that as we're getting just a few chapters into this, seeing all the things that are displeasing to the Lord and all the ways that we do things that are awful to each other, and God is still dwelling amidst this group. Again, that just the graciousness of God still is just pointing out to me over and over and over again. But let's move on for the sake of time. Verse 11 in chapter 6 talks about the priest having to change his clothes when he carries the ashes of the offering outside the camp. Why change the clothes? Is this just tied to the same touching of unclean things, or is there some more significance to this? What do you think about this verse?
Well, my answer is not incredibly complicated, but I think that the priest wore holy clothing while carrying out sacred work, or could say holy work, and then he changed into common clothing while doing common work. Like we talked about before, some clothing was used for holy purposes and could not be worn at just any time. For example, we read about the priestly tunic and the breastpiece that the priest wore. This was symbolic. It was it represented Israel and the priest's love and dedication to Israel. And so I think that it's like a visual picture of, okay, the certain work is this is holy work, and you not just anyone can rush in and do this. So certain garments were worn to represent that holy work, and then there was more common. So the opposite of holy is common. So I mean, you can say, well, isn't it unholy? Well, I mean, I like common better, just because
200 years ago we would have used the word profane. Now that's come to mean something else in our day and time. But
right.
You would have had the sacred and the profane, the common, that there seems to be those garments were set aside special for that holy work, and that holy work didn't include carrying buckets of ash out, and so
that's exactly my point. Yep.
And I mean, I'll give I think a profoundly unspiritual take here, so you guys can throw rocks at me if you want. But I mean,
my pleasure.
Could it be that it's like just for the same reason that I don't wear my gym clothes to church? It could be that there's
because you're a Pharisee.
Yeah, that's
okay.
No, but because there's just some clothes that you wear for some tasks, and you don't wear them for other tasks. I'm not going to carry these ashes out in my priestly garments. Maybe I'm not looking deeply into it enough, but I think sometimes we do have a tendency to put a lot of weight on certain things, especially as you read the really fine details in the Pentateuch. Like people do this specifically with the tabernacle. Like they talk about the rings of the tabernacle and like the rings that held up the curtains, and they want to find like a special piece of
a mystical meaning behind
significance that points to Christ and
no, it just held the curtain up. That's what it did.
I'm more likely than many people, I think, to probably interpret the Old Testament in a very Christ-centered way. But like some of the rings were certainly to hold the curtain up, So.
And I'm much more likely to pick and choose where I want to imbue symbolic significance. So I'm with you there, and I think I'm with you. I mean, the priestly garments were for something very specific, and so don't use those doing this over here. And I think if God had chosen to, He could have given a list as long as our arm of things you're not supposed to do while wearing the priestly robes. It was just this was connected closely enough that, hey, a distinction had to be made for this, but not this.
Yeah, this could have seemed like it was a continuation of the priestly duties because it was tied to the sacrifices. Yep. And but it could be as simple as, and I tend to agree, don't get these are nice garments that were made for this purpose. It's not when you're now taking these buckets of ash. It's not, you don't need to get these all filled with ash. So I think that's all well said. Verse 18 in the same chapter talks about if anybody touches the remainder of the grain offering, they become consecrated. And then a little bit later, verse 27, the same thing is said about a sin offering. what does that language mean? Is that can any clarification you can give on what it means for them to become consecrated?
My answer is more of an observation. It's kind of a dodge.
It's my favorite kind.
Yeah. But in verse 27, if blood from the sin offering splashed on a garment, the garment had to be kept in the holy place and washed. That's the way I understand the text. And once it became consecrated, it couldn't be exposed to common things. So in other words, the blood could not leave the holy place. It had to stay there. That was the place where it was supposed to be. And notice that touching an unclean thing made something unclean, and touching a holy or consecrated thing made something holy. It's like both were contagious. And I don't, there's a few different interpretations of this. I'm not 100% comfortable with choosing one or the other, but I will say that that it's like, if something is holy, it has to be only used for that holy purpose. In this case, the blood. The blood had to remain in that holy place. You couldn't take it elsewhere. You couldn't just do whatever you wanted with it. You can't treat something holy as common. And I think that's my very weak answer to the question. I know there's so much more to it than that. I'm just going to restrain myself from rambling here.
Yeah, I think that something that we often miss about the sacrificial system is that it wasn't just provision to make expiation or atonement for sins. It also symbolized a change in domain, if you will. When you go, these are people who are being brought up into the mountain of God. These are people who are being brought into the presence of God, who are being set apart as a holy people for His sake. And especially holy is the process by which all that happens, which is the Levitical priesthood and all of the sacrifices that have to do with that. So really, like when you touch something that is consecrated for this purpose, you're transferring domains. You're transferring domains from the common to the holy. And I mean, maybe this will get me a demerit, but that reality is ultimately fulfilled in Christ. That is the ultimate change of domains. It's what all this pointed to. It's being transferred from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light, from the nations of the world into this holy nation, this royal priesthood, people for His own possession. But there's also another aspect of the sacrificial system that is tied to that I think people miss, and that is that of fellowship with God. There's a reason that priests sit down and eat these sacrifices. There's even portions, we're going to get to this later, where the individual worshiper will eat a portion of this sacrifice. And then there are whole burnt offerings, which are consumed in their entirety, and they go up into heaven, as it were. These things are all pointing to fellowship with God in the holiness of God, fellowship with God in this domain of the holy. I think that sometimes we miss that. There's this really clear boundary that you're crossing when you come into the presence of holy things.
Well, first biblical theology project conversation, and first demerit for you.
No,
yes,
I'm vetoing it.
You're vetoing it?
I think if we now have 4, and yeah, I'm vetoing. That was a good one. So
the points are good. It doesn't matter if it's good or not. He ran ahead. He gets a demerit. You don't get to veto. I don't know what powers you think you have.
Is this by vote?
It's been vetoed. It's been vetoed.
It's never been by vote. All right. In Greg's book, no demerit has been given, but my book is the one that matters, and 1 demerit for Micah. It's okay, as you'll learn. They don't mean it. They don't really mean it. We're trying to stay on task here. Greg, do you have anything else to add on this? I have an alternative interpretation, which I want to at least have you guys
go ahead and present that, and I'll tell you why you're both wrong. Yeah.
Okay. So in these verses, of course, most of us, I think all of us, Mike, are you reading the New American Standard, or do you have a different translation?
I have the ESV.
You have the ESV. So this verse says that, in the New American Standard, will become consecrated. The ESV says, whoever touches them shall become holy. The NET gives an alternative translation, and it is interesting. And this really drives back to the point that Eric made. The law, if if this translation is correct, it does seem that both things might be contagious. Touching something unclean makes you unclean, and touching something holy makes you holy. I think we need to keep this thought in mind because there are some future texts that we'll get to, still in the Old Testament, that will offer some interpretations about this. I'm not sure that holiness is contagious. I am sure that uncleanness is contagious. You touch something unclean, you become unclean. But the NET offers an alternative translation saying anyone who touches these gifts must be holy. So it doesn't say that they become holy, but it's a rendering of saying these things are holy, and so the person themselves must not be in a state of uncleanness in order to touch them. So like if you had touched a carcass, then you are forbidden from touching these things. And the same rendering could be given for the final verse as well. So does that change anything? I mean, it does significantly change the meaning of this, that a priest could be set apart for those duties, but maybe they did something that caused them to be unclean. Now they are being restricted from touching some of these things, even if they ordinarily would be allowed to, but now because of their uncleanness, for whatever reason, they're maybe temporarily restricted. What do you make of that alternative interpretation? Is this a point worth, to me, it is a point worth keeping in mind, especially for later on, because I am not sure that I agree that holiness is contagious. I think that uncleanness is, but
isn't this? And I'm probably going to go ahead and grab my first demerit of the day. Isn't this addressed in the New Testament? Oh goodness!
What is the New Testament, Greg?
never. Yeah. I know you're ignorant of it, so I'll just go ahead and let it drop. But
okay.
But
now there's in the Minor Prophets, I have in my mind, and I'm not going to take us there, but there is there's a call for a ruling that encounters some of these things.
That's what I'm thinking of. Yes.
That's what I was. That's
and in the New Testament, again, I'll take the demerit. In the New Testament, you start to see questions about Christ's willingness to make contact with unclean people. It seems that the Pharisaical type of attitude did not think that holiness was transferred. It's if the holy and the unholy make contact, it's the unholiness that then causes the holy to be defiled. And so I tend to lean more towards, I like the New American Standard, but I tend to lean more towards the way that the NET renders this particular phrase. It's not.
Is it not
the
clear?
Idea,
the Hebrew's not clear?
It's imperfective. So the idea of becoming or in a state of both are equally possible translations to the best of my understanding. So anyway, I don't know if you guys have other thoughts on this. I don't want to belabor the point.
Remind me again the prophet where the ruling is. Obviously I thought it was the New Testament, so I was way off. But
I'm thinking it's Habakkuk. But
I was thinking Haggai, but we both thought H's. So.
No, I think maybe you're right. I think it is Haggai.
I think it is. Haggai is what I thought.
Yeah, so a third of a demerit for all of us. But there's an idea of holding the holy meat in the folds of a consecrated garment. And do they become holy? No, they don't. But does it become defiled? It does. And that seems to be the correct interpretation of those things. And so if I'm using Scripture to interpret Scripture, and again, this is defying the spirit of our argument, our project here. But if we kept this in mind, and then we get there later, by the time we read back to this, that's what pushes me to the side of saying the NET is probably correct, because then I would have a harder time reconciling these later teachings with that idea. And it is, at least as I read it, and again, I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I have some facility with it, but it seems like it is ambiguous. And then you compare modern English translations. There is, it is reasonably interpreted either way, and I tend to lean towards the. Again, this gets back to Eric. I guess I disagree with the point that you made, that holiness is also contagious. And I'll if you think that, that's fine. Like I say, I can't say this. The way it reads in the New American Standard certainly lends to that idea.
Well, it's funny enough. I would have disagreed with that statement, not because I knew of the alternative interpretation. I have the NET sitting before me. I don't always reference it, so I didn't see that. But that doesn't seem to be borne out through the rest of Scripture, though I can't use the rest of Scripture to defend.
Not without getting a demerit.
Not without getting.
You're already
demerits.
way ahead.
But we see leading up to this, this would be the first instance where just anybody could walk up, touch this thing, and you are now consecrated, right? We look at the priest. What was it, 7 days of consecration that the priest had to go through? Well, why bother with all that? Just go ahead and touch the offering and you're good, right? And so that seemed in my mind to present a little bit of cognitive dissonance.
Which is why in the discussion of how you can become unclean, it seems like it's saying you must be in a state of cleanness,
yes,
morally and ceremonially, to be able to touch these things.
Well,
it's Haggai chapter 2, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, in the whole verse, it seems it's drawing a distinction between the sons of Aaron and others, if you read the whole thing. So every male among the children of Aaron may eat of it, as decreed forever throughout your generations from the Lord's food offerings. My translation says whatever touches them shall become holy. Could it just be saying Aaron and his sons, who are consecrated for this purpose, can do this? And because they have become holy, they've been set apart for this.
Well,
no one else.
Then I think I think in a longer version, you're making the same argument that the NET.
Yeah.
And I'm not disagreeing with that at all. I'm just saying, I think you're basically saying the same thing at that point.
Well, and my original point had nothing to do with a person. It was about a garment. Because it says in verse
18, whoever touches them will become, if we're strictly following the NASB.
Right. Well, in 20, this is, so I get what you guys are saying. And I think we know in later texts, there's truth to that. As I read this in context, I don't know, maybe, and I could be off here, but in verse 26, the priest who offers it for a sin for sin, shall eat it. It shall be eaten in a holy place, in the court of the tent of meeting. Talking about domain here. It has to be eaten within this area. And then in 27, he says, anyone who touches its flesh will become consecrated. So that is talking about a person, at least it seems like that. And when any of its blood splashes on a garment in a holy place, you shall wash what was splashed on it. Now, the question is, why would you have to wash it? If this blood is good, if this is something that makes something good, then why would you have to clean it? It's almost
the argument could be because, listen, the blood of this covenant, which is holy, is now splashed onto something common. So get that holy blood out of that profane, common garment. It doesn't belong. It doesn't. The mixing of the holy with the unholy. It doesn't belong there.
Well, true, but it says that the garment is consecrated now.
Doesn't say doesn't say the garment's consecrated. It's not at all what it says.
Well, I'm interpreting it that way because consecration is the whole thing that's brought up.
Anyone who touches its flesh either will become or must be consecrated.
Mm-hmm.
Semicolon. When any of the blood splashes on a garment, when it splashes on a garment in the holy place, that's where it's happening, you shall wash that which was splashed. So it never says the garment becomes consecrated.
Okay, but I want to make a tiny little minuscule observation here. In the NASB, the comma is after garment. So it says. So what it's saying is, when the blood splashes on the garment, it says, in a holy place, you can't wash this just anywhere. You have to keep this in the holy place because now this transmission has taken place. So I don't know.
Contact has taken place. I agree. Contact between blood and a garment has taken place, but the text nowhere tells me has the garment been imbued with the quality of consecration.
Well, I admit that it does not explicitly say that, so I will grant you that.
Yeah.
I'm just that's an interpretation, not a something that the text explicitly says.
I think
we don't need to belabor the point, Micah. If you have anything, we'll give you the last word on this if you want.
Yeah, I think it might come down to whether this is meant to be imperative or indicative. So when it says whatever touches its flesh shall be holy, is that an indicative state of things, like when it touches, it becomes holy? Or is it an imperative, like you must be holy if you're gonna
touch it? Yeah.
Touch it. I think it kind of comes down to that question.
It's an interesting issue, and again, for us as new covenant believers, that we could go on, and it's been fulfilled in Christ. But as we see the importance of maintaining holiness, I appreciate the conversation. I'll go on the record. I lean towards the NET rendering of it, but the New American Standard, I can certainly understand why you're interpreting it the way that you are, Eric, as well, because based on the wording of it. And so this is one of the values of certainly reading different translations, and most of the time it's not a huge deal, but this is anyway, for the sake of time, we'll move on. Let's move into chapter 7, verses 11 through 18 give instructions regarding the peace offerings. And this passage suggests that the offerer ate some of his offering. Chapter 7, verse 18 seems to say that. Do you get the impression that the offerer, in a sense, shared a meal with God? Like, Micah, you were just talking about some of this kind of fellowship aspect. So if yes, then let's talk about that. If not, does it mean something else? I guess, how do you take this?
Well, the way that I've understood it is, it looks to me like there's the eating of the sacrifice, the eating of the offering. Well, it was revealing something about what the offering accomplished, and so the whole point of an offering was, this was directed at God. The offering was offered to God, and so eating it was almost like the offerer and God were sharing a meal together. Now how exactly this looked in practice, I don't know all the details of that, but the impression that I get as I read this is that because the offering was directed toward God, and some of it was consumed, and some of it was meant for God, but the offerer got to eat some too. It just seems to me like it's symbolizing the fact that the offering has allowed this fellowship to take place, or given opportunity for this fellowship to take place. That's the way that I've understood it, but I'm open to to other interpretations too.
Yeah, I think that we have to remember that the very first chapter of Leviticus. I don't. Does going back get me a demerit too?
No, you're good.
No,
okay. You can go back as often as you want to. Yeah.
The very first chapter of Leviticus, it outlines the laws detailed for the burnt offering, which was also known as the ascension offering, or that which goes up. Once again, there is an emphasis in these offerings, not just in the expiation of sin, but that which comes into the presence of God. As the whole burnt offering was consumed and the smoke rose up before the Lord, it was as if the offerer was entering into the presence of God by means of that sacrifice. Quite literally, I'm not going to go to the ascension of Jesus here, but I want to. I want to make that known.
If I did run ahead, this is what I would talk about.
You've already found my strategies on day one.
It wasn't that hard to decipher, Greg. I mean, come on. Yeah.
But it seems to me that at the very start of these laws about offerings, there is this emphasis upon fellowship with God. So it makes total sense to me. The priests eat portions of these offerings that are consecrated for them as they fellowship with God in their priestly capacity, and then there are certain aspects of it that the offerer themselves will eat as well. I think all of it is built upon how can we come into the presence of God and dine with Him, as it were.
That relational aspect, I think, is often lost, and I appreciate that. So, Greg, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to be the one that pushes back. I personally would not use the is sharing a meal with God verbiage. I think if that was the idea being communicated, I would have liked it to be a little bit more spelled out for me. In my eyes, as this peace offering, you have offered your portions. You are at peace with God. You sit down with this meal. Yes, in the presence of God. Yes, thankful for the peace of God. But I just don't see that image being explicitly enough drawn out for me to want to use those words. Though, if that's the case, yay that. I'm just surprised that it wasn't spelled out that clearly.
That's why we need the New Testament.
Well, actually, even later in the Old, There's
Yeah.
some very revealing verses about
But
that.
at this point,
So
Greg,
go
even,
ahead and tell me more demerits.
No.
Come on, how can
Greg.
you? If I had said any of that,
I'm trying to be gracious to Micah. He's new. He's learning the ropes here. Greg, for you, if even if you wouldn't go that far, and I think that's perfectly fair, you would still though acknowledge the relational aspect of this. So even if you don't take it that
100%.
far,
Yeah,
you're not getting rid of all the.
I'm just saying,
relational aspect.
using those words, I'm sitting down to share a meal with God. I just wouldn't use those words, though. Of course, the relational aspect, the peace with God, the fact that you can sit down and enjoy this because of the provision of God. All of that, yay. I just wouldn't have used I'm sitting down to, we're sitting down at a barbecue with God. Just, and
I don't know that anybody said it.
I know you
way.
didn't say that, but I'm taking it one step further as my role
I think
in the show.
it looked like Eric had something to add to that.
I don't remember if we cover. I don't remember.
Don't
if we covered
feign
this
ignorance to try to cover demerit.
No,
You're going to bear your guilt, even if you're ignorant. Yeah.
Well, the Old Testament uses a certain word for God for an offering, and I'm not quite sure if we've covered the verse yet. But actually, some offerings are referred to as God's food, and so
I don't remember us talking about that yet.
Dang it,
Demerit.
But it's repeated over and over again. Some offerings were described in that way. So if the offerer is offering food to God, God is in a sense partaking of it, and the offerer is eating his portion. I think you do get the impression.
I'd want to just look at the context of those offerings, right? Because we already talked about how some offerings do this, some offerings do this, some offerings, and so we have to understand the different contexts of the different offerings. My point only is here in this text with this peace offering, I don't see enough to say you're sitting down to share a meal with God. Again, if I'm wrong, I have no emotional attachment to this position at all. But that's what
fair.
I'm seeing from the text.
I have a lot of emotional attachment.
I know you seem like an emotional guy to me.
I am a little emotional.
Are you really? Okay.
But back in chapter 1, you see exactly the kind of language that Eric was referencing there. In chapter 1 regarding, I know this is a different offering, but it does help us to see the sort of drift of these sacrifices, the sacrificial system itself.
Where are we looking exactly, brother?
Chapter 1 in verse 9, the priest shall burn all of it on the altar as a burnt offering, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So please, when I hear pleasing aroma,
so we're not reading that in the
God is being.
It's part of my problem. I don't spend a whole lot of time in the ESV, and for a food offering, it isn't present in the ESV. So
I'm talking about pleasing aroma specifically.
Pleasing aroma. I'm sorry. So you added food offering to that text then?
No, that's
that is how the ESV.
My point regards the pleasing aroma language. The pleasing aroma language does refer to as if a man were smelling a delicious meal. I do think that
you were the brisket guy. You were the one.
I was the brisket. Yeah. So my only point is so my two main texts that I'm using, NASB and NET, and so the NASB doesn't put forth anything. It's a food offering, whereas the NET does give. It's a gift, a burnt offering, a gift, a soothing aroma. And I haven't dug into the notes yet. So, yes, because of my lack of seeing that in my primary text, I wouldn't automatically go to I'm sharing a meal with God.
I'm probably just going to take a demerit here, and the reason is, and I rarely, if ever, take demerits because I'm just really good about I have an incredible amount of self-control.
Because you're a suck up? Is that what you said? I misunderstood you.
Well, it could be. But later, see, we're in Leviticus. If you just jump just a few chapters, not a couple, a few chapters ahead, Leviticus 21 verse 6.
Oh, goodness gracious!
They shall be holy to their God and not profane the name of their God, for they present the offerings by fire to the Lord, the food of their God. So they shall be holy. And there's numerous.
Yay to all that. I'm just saying.
And I know, but you're sticking to this text. So
sitting down to share a meal with God. I don't. And maybe that's what. Maybe I'm fully admitting. Maybe I'm wrong for not seeing that mental image pop up. It's just. It's just not there for me.
And that's fair because we're sticking to this chapter. So,
what image does God eating bread conjure up for you? That's what I want to know.
And he's not going to Christ in the New Testament again, is what he's really trying to say. The point, it probably is overly nuanced for us to keep on going round and round on it. But I am thankful that we all at least appreciate the more relational nature of this. I think that a lot of people who aren't familiar with the Old Testament, they think about this as just some kind of mechanical thing, and there is an overwhelming desire to have fellowship with God, who came to dwell in the tabernacle at the end of Exodus, which is why this book is right here. And maintaining that continual presence is a relational aspect that God desires to be among His people and wants them to have fellowship with Him. And whether or not it is, we're going so far as to use that language or not, at least the relational aspect, I think we all agree on. And so let's move forward for the sake of time. In verse 30 of this same chapter, chapter 7, we read about a wave offering. What is a wave offering?
Well, I borrowed this definition from the Cambridge Bible commentary because I thought it was so clear and straightforward. The offering was waved towards the altar and back, apparently to express symbolically that it was first given to God and then restored by Him to the priest for his use. So that's the definition that the Cambridge Bible commentary gives.
I don't have a whole lot on this one other than that it just does. It seems to be another form of consecration for the use of the priesthood, but I don't have anything a whole lot deeper than that.
Yeah, I'm probably going to fall pretty much the same way. I mean, it's an offering that eventually goes to the priests. It's not burnt up prior to. I think this is the way of presenting it to the Lord and then getting passed on to the priest.
Yeah, it is the symbolism of that, Eric. I like that definition. My understanding of it is something that you literally hand and you wave it towards the altar. What if you didn't do that? Like, I mean, you still have to do that, right? I mean, if you're like, oh, this is mine and I'm just not going to go through it, you still have to do it. And so I think that maybe the symbolism of that is interesting. I like that idea of, okay, it's presented and now it's being restored, and still going through those motions was an important part of this. But it might seem, again, silly to some who would say, well, okay, you take this thing and ultimately it's for you, but you go and, put it before the altar. Maybe you could just skip that step. But I like that definition. I never heard that before. So I don't have anything, though, to add beyond that. So if you guys don't, we can jump into chapter 8. In chapter 8, the remaining portions of the bull that weren't burned had to be buried outside of the camp. Leviticus 8:17 talks about that. Why this part of the provision?
Well, I think as I read this, I obviously when I'm reading through all these things, I have the New Testament in mind. But I think even without the New Testament, I think it's, in my opinion, fairly clear that this was a symbolic act of removing sin from God's people and God's kingdom. Again, we've been talking about like separation. It was symbolically, separating or removing sin from Israel. I think that's the meaning that I got from it. And I really I don't think you would even need the New Testament to know that.
Part of the curse of sin is being taken outside of the camp. You see that throughout the entirety of the Old Testament. I mean, Adam and Eve are exiled from Eden, from the immediate presence of God. They're driven east of Eden. As Cain sins, his people are driven even further east of Eden. There appears to be this separation aspect, and you can unpack what that separation means. It's obviously I'm pretty sure we all believe God is omnipresent here, so it's not separation from the presence of God ontologically, but it is separation from the blessing presence of God. It is separation from the presence with which God is pleased to dwell among His people in a saving way. It's separation from communion and fellowship with God. I think that in many ways is the fullness of the curse being poured out, is being taken outside of the camp, outside of that blessing presence of God, and I think that's what's pictured there.
In addition to all that, I mean, we are talking about all of the refuse left over, the parts of the sacrifice that weren't acceptable for sacrifice. So, I don't want it buried under my tent. So yeah, let's take it outside the camp and bury it, or under Eric's, I suppose. But But I mean, there is a very practical reason for this has no part in the sacrificial offering, and it needs to be gotten rid of. And again, not under my tent. So yeah, let's take it outside the camp.
I introduced error. I think I said buried. Verse 17 says burned outside the camp. So
gotten rid of.
I introduced error into our conversation, so I apologize about that. But yes, it needs to be taken out and gotten rid of out there and burned out there. So otherwise, everything makes sense. But I'm sorry, Greg, if I
I'm sorry. I
led you
didn't.
Astray.
No, you're right. I should have looked more careful. I should not have trusted you.
Yeah, don't trust me. I'm not always trustworthy. Later on in verse 8, we read that the ordination process for Aaron and his sons would go across 7 days or through 7 days, or was a 7-day period. What do you make about that lengthy ordination process?
Well, the ceremony lasted 7 days, the ceremony of consecration, and so it makes sense that Aaron and his sons were, kind of like set aside or separated in that sense for, during that period. They weren't allowed to participate in, common things during that time. So they had to be separate. They had to be in a holy place during this entire ceremony of consecration, if you will, that lasted 7 days. So that's the way that I see it.
I'm sure you all know this, but there's symbolic numbers throughout the entirety of the Old Testament. 7 appears to be a number of perfection. I think you could say that this 7-day period is the perfection of their being set apart for the service of the Lord. It's the total transfer, if you will, into the domain of the holy, that they're going to do all of their service and live much of their lives in. You could say that it's a complete bond between Aaron and his sons and the Lord. They're transferring domains in a certain sense.
I don't know. God, why? Because God, that's what God said. Sure. The 7, obviously you have 7 days of creation. We see a lot of 7s. I like the term complete rather than perfect, but, is that playing a role? Very possibly. Again, I just tend to be a more literal person. Like if I was supposed to understand that, I would just want it to be a little bit more explicit for me, but, very, very, very possible.
The symbolic aspect, I don't deny that there is definitely recurring use of numbers. What I do get nervous of is when people say what those numbers represent, if the text itself doesn't say this. And that's not to say that I disagree with at least conceptually what you're saying. This was a significant thing. They were being set apart. As I read this verse, they're in the tent of meeting. It does seem maybe even as simple though as okay, it's going to be impossible for them to touch anything unclean in there. So they're going to be that consecration will be completed and guaranteed, at least at this initial aspect. And of course, once they come out of there, then they're opening up many opportunities for potential defilement, or whether intentionally or unintentionally, that they could be desecrated in some way. But anyway, interesting conversation. Let's move into the last one. This is the chapter 9. This was the question that I was most interested in discussing. It's the most dramatic element of it. And maybe you guys won't be as excited about this as I am. But verse 24, kind of leading up to this, that we see the preparations, and then verse 24 says that fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the portions of fat on the altar. So why did God actually do this himself? Everything, it seems like we've been getting this expectation about the duties of the priest and how they were going to do it. And then God makes this very dramatic display of sending out this fire and consuming the offering. So what do you make of this kind of ending scene at the end of chapter 9?
I think God did this to show his approval of all the ceremonial things, all the preparation that took place before that point. God was saying, I've seen all that you've done. I see that you are doing what I've told you to do. You're following me. You're following my instructions in all these ways. And so he sent this fire out to basically to demonstrate his approval of all that they had done so far. And this is not the only time in Scripture where God, burns sacrifices himself. So we will, I won't get into any detail, but God does this at other times too. But it's interesting, like up until this point, we've seen man is the one doing the the burning and setting the fires and stuff. And
except
and
Abram,
God
right?
says-
You could have pointed to.
Could have gone back.
You could have gone back to Abram.
That's right.
I'm not disagreeing. I'm completely agreeing with you. But
Well, I should have remembered. I don't always remember everything that we've covered, but that is definitely true. So
Shame on you.
I failed
Shame.
miserably.
Shame. Yeah. Well said. Are we
That's
cutting
it.
you off? Did you? Okay. Right on.
It's like, I've had enough.
That's it.
I tend to think about this in terms of the level of assurance that this would give to the average Israelite who is not involved with any of this stuff. So everyone's involved to some extent. They bring their offerings and things like that, but they didn't receive directly in their own ears these instructions from the Lord. They're going by secondhand information in some regards. To see just this divine attestation that these are my sacrifices. This is how I'm dealing with your sin. This is how I'm bringing you into my presence. It's not just Aaron conjuring something up. It's not just the priesthood saying this is how we're going to try to approach God. No, this is how I'm bringing you into my presence. I think that would give a massive amount of assurance to the people that saw it.
Yeah. No, I think my answer was something of a blend of both of yours. Yes, this is God showing his approval, but I think it's also painting a very vivid image in the minds of the people that God is present and involved in this and active in this. This isn't just something you're doing. This is that communal thing that you're doing together. And so for me, that rather than sitting down and eating, it's the sacrifice that I see as the more communal thing.
Well, I think I'm in full agreement with everything I'm hearing from you guys, and it does seem that God has begun a pattern of, in some instances, being very dramatic at the onset of something to show that he is in it. And then as you carry on, even if some of the dramatic flair goes away, we can still have the same confidence that as long as we continue in the path that God has set, that God is still pleased with these things. And I think that probably sometimes people, they long for the dramatic, and we have no really expectation that's set that God would participate in the sacrifices like this every single time. This seems to be an initial demonstration. Yes, I'm pleased with these things. I am participating in these. But from this point forward, you should be expecting that the priest will be doing this. And so God's not always going to show up in this form and fashion. And God does sometimes break in very dramatic displays, and when he does, we ought to pay very careful attention. And then sometimes we just do well to remember back to what God has already set his divine seal of approval on, and then just make sure that we're carrying out these things. What I would add to the conversation is, I think this is also probably setting an expectation of, okay, this is what God does when they're obeying everything. What would we expect if they deviate? And we might not have to read too much further to find that out, but that would take us beyond our current conversation, because this is up to the end of Leviticus 9. So that's all the questions that we had on our show sheet. You guys got anything else that just from the conversation, or anything that you wanted to bring up for conversation before we sign off for this episode?
No, I think I'm all set. Eric has
We've
something.
covered it.
Oh.
No, these chapters are really sometimes really hard to understand. Certain details, anyway. The main point, if you just look at what is the main point of this chapter, I think the main point is clear enough. But some of the details are really hard to understand sometimes, and I just encourage our viewers, with texts like this, if you take the Bible as a whole, which we're intentionally not doing.
Well, we will do it. Just is going to take us a really long time.
Yeah. We're trying to go through this as if we're going through it for the first time. But the more you read and the more scripture you compare with other scripture, it really sheds a tremendous amount of light on these things.
And if
you don't do it this way, hang on, Greg, make your point. But if you don't do it this way, a lot of times these verses will get left out. But trying to take the Bible as a whole, if we just these are not going to make it into a lot of systematic theologies, probably, these particular verses. And so there is a method to this madness of going this slow. But sorry, Greg, go ahead and make.
Oh, I was just going to say, we do have a couple thousand years worth of history where Bible interpreters, in an attempt to handle these details that sometimes I think are better left just going because God said so, they've spiritualized it, and we've gotten so used to hearing these spiritualized, allegoricalized answers for what does this mean, that we feel like we have to rush to do the same thing or to do it better, or to adopt the same allegories or spiritualizations that they have. And so, like with the whole sharing a meal with God, like that, like I don't want to deny that might be what's happening, but I also don't want to have to find an allegory or spiritualization or some image that wasn't given in the text. And again, you very well may be right. I just personally want to be careful to not do, there's ditches on both sides of the road, right? So I just want to be careful to not fall in either one.
I think following up on that, and I don't want to attribute motive to other people, so I'm not.
Oh yeah, that's not motive.
I'm not saying this is necessarily the reason, but I feel sometimes that we read passages like the main meat of what we were reading today, and it's not all that exciting, and so we try and make it more exciting with some of these allegories or spiritual things. Whereas the actual excitement of this is why I was looking forward to the end of it. When God showed up and consumed these sacrifices, if you were part of that group, think of how awesome that would have been. It would have been tremendous. It would have been just an incredible experience. Just like we talked about at the end of Exodus, where you kind of get bogged down in the details. And so people are going to try and shoehorn Christ into all these things about the clasps or whatever. If we just take it for what it is, when they obeyed, God came down and dwelt in their presence. And, not to deny omnipresence. Of course, God is already in some sense, but he chose to dwell in their midst in a magnificent and glorious way. And that's the excitement of a text like that. And if we skip some of the quote unquote tedious details, and if we skip over some of the just the very nuanced nature of everything that has to go into maintaining this holy, glorious presence of God amongst his people, and the fact that God wants to do that, and he's trying to do it in a way that he doesn't kill everybody while he does it, is to me exciting on its own without having to try and add in this other stuff. But it doesn't probably get as many people to come to your seminar or to buy your book. When we come up with, if we can out allegorize the last guy, that's usually where you get a lot of clicks and views and whatever. So like I say, I'm not trying to attribute motive, but I don't know, you guys, I think, read it the same way as I do. By the time we get to the end of chapter 9, that's pretty exciting stuff. If we take it on its own terms, I don't think that
chapter 10 is even more exciting. So let's
and we'll get there next. So, yeah. Micah, you got we'll give you the last word on this before we say goodbye. But anything else you got to add before we sign off?
Just a word about the seemingly surface level boredom and tedium of some of the details. I think we need to cultivate our appetites to get excited about the right things. Especially when we're dealing with Scripture. Because if we fail to do that, you miss a lot of glory. This text does, even in the apparently boring and tedious portions of it. It's telling you who God is. I don't think we should throw around words like boring and tedious. Obviously, I say those words tongue in cheek.
Right. That's why I tried to put it in quotes.
Yeah.
I don't really view it that way, but I know so many people do, and it's. I like your language, cultivating an appetite. That's
very helpful.
I appreciate.
You stole that from someone, so I'd be interested.
I'm sure I did. I don't have any original thoughts.
Neither do I.
Well, let's let that be the end of our discussion for today. As always, guys, I appreciate your perspective. If you're still watching this and you enjoyed the episode, if you got any value out of it, consider clicking that thumbs up button. Consider subscribing if you haven't already, or sharing this episode with others that you think might be edified by a conversation like this. We'd also love to read your comments down below. We did cover a lot of chapters today, and certainly didn't talk about everything that could have been talked about. So do you agree with us? Do you disagree with us? Is there something else that you would have liked to hear us talk about? Feel free to sound off in the comments below. And until we see you again, friends, get equipped, obey your King, and glorify your God.
That's it. That's it.